Welcome to a special podcast series, Breaking the Silence, Canada's Classrooms of Injustice, a series that delves into the stories about the federal day school system, produced by the Legacy of Hope Foundation with the generous support of the Indigenous Screen Office. Over the course of 8 episodes, we'll hear powerful stories and reflections that shed light on the often overlooked impacts of the federal day school system on Indigenous peoples, families, and communities. Join us as we listen, learn, and honor the stories that must be heard and must never be forgotten. Today, in our final episode of the Federal Day School Series podcast project, host Gordon speaks with Blackfoot scholar Apooyak'ii Dr. Tiffany Prete. Dr. Prete is a member of the Kainai blood tribe, assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Lethbridge, and the Canadian Research Chair in Indigenous Resiliency. In this revealing, reflective, and highly informative discussion, Dr. Prete sheds light on Canada's broader colonial education project, the ways systemic racism in the schooling system continues to impact achievement gaps for Indigenous youth, and her ongoing work on Call to Action 78. As their discussion winds down, Dr. Prete shares the honor that she feels being able to carry out this research and work for her community. Please enjoy this episode of the Roots and Hoots podcast Day School Series project.
Dr. Prete, maybe you can just begin by telling us a little bit about yourself and your community and your family.
Yeah, for sure. So thank you very much for having me today. I'm a member of Kainai, and in English, that's the blood tribe, which is part of Apooyak'ii C2B, which means Blackfoot Confederacy. And we are located in the Treaty 7 area that's in southwestern Alberta. We're comprised of 4 nations within Blackfoot Confederacy. So we have Siksika, Piikani, Kainai, and Apooyak'ii that's in the United States. So we have tribes both in Canada and the United States. Kainai is the largest land-based reserve in Canada. We're just short of being 1,500 square kilometers, and we have a band membership of over 13,000 members. And today I'm joining you just south of my reserve, which is the Blood Reserve.
Can you please share how your education journey that led you to specializing in Indigenous people's education?
Because of the Indian Act, I received a public education, and my experiences were largely negative. From an early age, I learned how the rest of Canada viewed Indigenous people and where we were placed within the social order. And I quickly realized that some of the people around me held lower expectations of who I could be, not because of anything that I've said or anything that I did, but simply just because I am an Indigenous person. And I had teachers who openly expressed these low expectations. Some told me that I would never make it through high school. Others said that they thought that I would drop out of school with a teenage pregnancy or even die of a drug overdose before finishing high school. I had another teacher tell me that there's no way that I'd ever make it through one semester of university and that I shouldn't even try. And these are, very horrible things to be told, and I'm sure that it would be very similar to many other Indigenous peoples or experiences going through the public school system. And though I told myself not to believe in these horrible things that were said to me, their words still affected me, and they would often pop back in my mind and resurface when I was attending university. And so I found that I really struggled the first couple of years that I was attending university. And I often wondered if my teachers and the things that they said about me, if they were right, if I, was smart enough to even make it through university. And it wasn't easy. I spent the first couple of years struggling, and I had to really look inwards and ask myself if this was the path that I really wanted to walk down. But so much is my belief in my people and my love for my people that I really wanted to persevere and to get education. It was something that was really impressed upon me by my family members, my tribal members, and my leaders about getting an education. And so I turned to ceremony and to prayer and to fasting and asking for the creator's help and helping me understand what it is that I need to do with my life. And as Blackfoot, we're taught that we must come to find our place in the universe. As well, that the creator has blessed us with unique gifts and talents that set us apart from anybody else, and that we are meant to use these gifts to bless our tribal members with. And so eventually I felt like I was being led down the path of education, and I transferred into the Faculty of Education at the University of Alberta. And that decision led me to enter into graduate studies, and I entered into Indigenous Peoples Education. And graduate studies intrigued me as it was one way that could help fill a gap that I felt like I had received in my undergraduate degree, where I don't think that it really helped prepare me to meet the needs of my people. And so I wanted to take Indigenous people's education. And as well, I wanted to be of service to my people. And research seemed like it would be one way. And so I completed my master's and eventually my doctorate, both in Indigenous people's education.
Wow, pretty awesome. Was there a day school in your community growing up?
Growing up, yes, but so my people, our history is a little bit different, in that because we are one of the largest land-based reserve in Canada. The Canadian government actually had day schools on our reserve at two different times, and so we had day schools in operation on the Blood Reserve from the 1880s until about 1905, and then they started up again in the 1950s until 1988. And then those schools turned into two federal schools. And so, what many Canadians may not know is that the Canadian government created several different school models to try and assimilate Indigenous children. And I think that the most often model that gets talked about is the residential schools. And we do have a lot of survivors today who did attend residential schools, but we also did have day schools. We also had other types of school models as well. And so on my reserve, we had several day schools, some in the 1800s and then some in the 1950s.
For those people that don't know what a day school is, can you describe what a day school is?
Yes. So I'll talk about the ones in the 1800s, as well as the ones that we had that open in the 1950s. And so for my people, we signed Treaty 7, which was in 1877, and we would eventually be forced to relocate on our reserve. And so at that time, we lived in our clan system, and that's how we ended up living on our reserve. And so these clans became villages, and the early day schools were created to be in the midst of these villages. And at that time, it wasn't mandatory for children to attend school. It was more just highly encouraged. And the early missionaries found it really quite challenging to get the children to attend school. I read in some of the reports that the teachers were complaining that, as soon as they would turn their backs on the children to write something on the chalkboard, that the children would be slipping out the windows or slipping out the doors. And on top of that, the children got to go home at the end of the day. They were living, the schools were in the midst of these villages. And so they got to go home, live with their families, continue speaking, Blackfoot, continue with their cultural way of life as Blackfoot people. And so the day school model wasn't really working out. The religions were complaining to the government that changes were needed and that the child needs to be separated from the parents in order to make any gains in assimilation. And the government would eventually listen to these complaints and realize that their assimilation efforts were not going very well. And they made adjustments to the Indian Act. They would create a new school model. And when one school model didn't work, they didn't abandon their plans of assimilation. They just created a new school model. But they did base their school models on the feedback of the different religions who were running these schools. And so on the Blood Reserve, for about 30 years, from 1880 to 1905, we did have the first day schools that were open. They were open intermittently at times because it was really hard to find qualified teachers or any kind of teachers to come and entice them to work on the reserves. It was, referred to being often isolating. It wasn't considered as prestigious as working in other teaching posts off reserve, and the pay wasn't as well as the pay you could get off reserve. And so, really, this is something that we could say of all the school models. It was really hard for the government to entice qualified and competent teachers to come and teach in these school models. And so we went through several school models, and in the 1950s, the government decided to go back to the day school model again. But it was a little bit different than how day schools were operating in the 1800s. The government had two tactics that they used to try and assimilate Indigenous children. So the first one was assimilation through segregation, and then the second was assimilation through integration. So the first day school models was segregation, where they were supposed to learn how to be like any other Euro-Western Canadian. And under the tactic of assimilation through integration, the Canadian government wanted to completely do away with any kind of education on reserve. They wanted to have children going off reserve into public school because they saw this as a way that they could more fully assimilate Indigenous children into learning how to be like any other non-Indigenous Euro-Western Canadian citizen. But it didn't really work out the way that the government had intended when they first introduced it. Um, a lot of the public schools didn't want to allow Indigenous children into their schools. As well, the Indigenous parents didn't really want to send their children off reserve either, because they had this fear that their children would experience racism in the public schools. And so it would take a couple of decades for public schools to really take off and to have Indigenous children attending like the way that we see it today. And so on my reserve, they still had residential schools at the same time that day schools were in operation, and so you could live at home with your parents if your parents were able to bring you back to the residential school every day. Otherwise, you would have to live at the residential school. And so, for those children who lived a great distance from the residential school and who didn't want to go off reserve to go to public school, they decided to open day schools again. And so we did have two day schools on the Blood Reserve at that time. So that children would still receive an education, but their parents wouldn't have to drop them off at the residential school each day. But they were supposed to be non-denominational because the government was trying to get away from having religions run the institution. But it was really hard for them, again, to find any kind of competent or qualified teachers. And so really all they could get to come were the same people who were operating the residential schools. So the day schools ended up operating just like any other religious residential school on the reserve.
What role did the Indian Act play in shaping the education of First Nations people? And how does it continue to affect education today?
So the purpose of the Indian Act has always been to assimilate Indigenous peoples into Canadian society, and the Canadian government sought not to physically eliminate Indigenous populations, but to systematically sever them from their ways of life, reshaping them into Euro-Canadian citizens who would no longer identify with their Indigenous heritage. And so central to this project was the colonial education system. And over time, the government experimented with various school models before settling on the residential school system, which endured for generations. When officials later attempted to assimilate through integration, their strategy involved abolishing on reserve schools in favor of public education. And in my research that I've conducted, I uncovered a letter where it talked about this plan. the government expressed a desire for Indigenous children to be living at home while attending public school, believing that it would be a more effective means of assimilation. And by immersing children into Canadian society, authorities believe that they would more quickly adopt the English or the French language, surpassing any progress that could be made in a residential school. And additionally, they hope that everything that the children were learning while they were in public school, that when they would come home and live with their parents, that it would also rub off on their parents. And they felt like this would be a better strategy at assimilating Indigenous peoples. And so public education then is just another extension of the Canadian government's broader assimilation agenda. And I think it's something that we don't really talk about in Canada. And so at the time that this letter was written, my grandmother was attending residential school, and it would take 2 generations in my family for this vision to that the government had for Indigenous children to be attending public school to occur in my own family. And so my mother went to residential school. And then in her last couple of years, she did attend public school for her high school and did live at home. But when it came time for me to go to school, I went to public school and I spent my entire time in public school. And this was exactly what the government wanted for Indigenous children, that they would be going to public school. And for many years, I was told that I was fortunate because the Indian Act has no direct effect on me, that my public education spared me from the interventions that the Canadian government would have had I gone to residential school. And I've come to realize that, this is absolutely not true. Even in my own public school experiences, I had the public school board would send a letter to my family every year asking to speak only English in the home. And they argued that it would be a disservice to us as students if we learned to speak Blackfoot, that it would put us behind in our education. And so, it really sent this message that in order to succeed academically, that we needed to abandon our language and basically abandon being who we are as Blackfoot people. And this was framed as being for our own good if we wanted to be successful in the classroom. And this sentiment, is something that really was something that I felt like I was receiving from the rest of Canada, where I was feeling that I could not be who I am as a Blackfoot person, that in order to be accepted by Canada, that I needed to be more like a Euro-Western Canadian. And so my public education experiences, like many other Indigenous peoples, has been filled with racism. I shared some of the lower expectations that were placed on me. And so, those experiences were pretty terrible. It really taught me to be silent, and to not to really raise my voice or to bring up any kind of issues, that I needed to be quiet, not draw attention to myself, and learn to be invisible in a system that wasn't designed for Indigenous peoples to actually succeed in. And this was exactly what the government had hoped for, to have Indigenous peoples in public education, and where we would be experiencing these kinds of things in our life. And so today we could say that Indigenous peoples who are attending public school, that they would be experiencing something similar. And historically, there's been a lack of Indigenous knowledge systems or perspectives in the public education system as well. We have seen in the past few decades a more willingness to include Indigenous perspectives and knowledges in the curriculum, especially with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, where they're trying to reconcile what has happened in the education system. I think that there, are those who are very interested in implementing those calls to action, but we also do see some lip service, tokenism, and empty gestures as well when it comes to the calls to action. And so I would say that public school system is still grappling with the lingering effects of colonial policies, where we are still seeing an underrepresentation of Indigenous languages, histories, and worldviews in the curriculum. We still do have this persistent achievement gap that Indigenous students are facing, and it is a direct result of the systemic racism that they face in the school system. Um, and so I feel very strongly that we need to still continue looking at the calls to actions and ways that we can implement them into the school system to be able to help dismantle the legacies, the colonial legacy and its effects that it has had on our school system and Indigenous peoples as well.
What year did the day school system stop, and I guess would be the federal day school, and then from that point on, the provincial public school would take over, which is what it is now. But so, what year did it end? Do you know?
Well, on my reserve, it ended in 1988. So we still did have a residential school, and we did have the day schools as well. But in 1988, my tribe took local control over their education system, and so all of those schools morphed into a federal school. And so where we still had the government still had a fiduciary responsibility for the education of Indigenous peoples, but that we would have more of a say over the curriculum. But still, in some ways, our hands are tied, because if we want our children to be able to go from our schools that are on reserve into any college or university, they still have to meet certain requirements by the province or anywhere that they plan to go to university. And so in Alberta, if you want to go to college or university, it is generally that you would have a provincial high school diploma. And so on my reserve, they do follow the Alberta curriculum, but there is still some freedom to make some changes in that, but they do have to follow the Alberta curriculum in order to get a high school diploma that will allow them to go to college or university.
The Indian Act has long been used as a tool of assimilation, as you were describing. What are your thoughts on whether it should be abolished, and what might be a better path forward?
Yeah, it's a tricky question, and one that I have heard talked about for many years. I know that there are some who are very much wanting to abolish the Indian Act, but there are still those who are hesitant in getting rid of the Indian Act, because there is some theories around, if we get rid of the Indian Act, what will happen to Indigenous peoples? Will we be expected to be like the rest of Canadians? Will there be any kind of anything in place that still ensures that we have rights as Indigenous peoples, as the original peoples of this land? And I think that, one path that we could take moving forward is really that we need to be able to have these kinds of conversations across Canada with Indigenous peoples that is community led about what should take place. Maybe not completely getting rid of the Indian Act, but maybe if we're able to have conversations about what kind of changes would we like to see in the Indian Act, because when it was created, there wasn't any kind of consultation with Indigenous peoples. And so it was created about Indigenous peoples without any kind of consultation, feedback. And it's something that has been, in place for such a long time, that has been so oppressive to Indigenous peoples. And so being able to make that space and time to have those conversations about how can we make changes to what is existing, maybe one way of taking a look at that.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned a bit about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action on the Blood Reserve. Is there anything else you want to add to that? Its successes and its its challenges that you faced.
Sure. So I am an intergenerational survivor of the residential school system. My mother, my grandparents, great grandparents, and so forth all attended residential school, and it really isn't something that got talked about. In my childhood, it was not something that was taught in even in my education, and so it's really been kind of one of these big mysteries to me where even just the way that I found out about residential schools was I was reading a book when I was in grade 3 about my people, and in that book it said that the blood people went to residential school, and I'd never heard anyone talk about it. And the book talked about residential schools as being these very wonderful places to grow up and to be educated in. And I remember going home and asking my mom why she never told me that she went to residential school. And and I learned that they were not wonderful places to grow up in, or to be a part of. And so I really wanted to be able to understand what had happened to my family members and to my tribal members, because being an intergenerational survivor, I didn't really understand everything that happened. And so I decided that I was going to turn to research to be able to look into the history of colonization and the colonial school system that's on the Blood Reserve. And with permission from my chief and council, I've spent nearly the past 10 years of my life researching into our history with colonization, specifically looking at the colonial school system. And so I've been working with Calls to Action 78, which urges communities to research and produce their own histories of residential school experiences and their involvement in truth, healing, and reconciliation. And so my research has taken me to mostly museums and archives across Canada, where I've been able to take a look at primary and secondary documents that were written by the Canadian government, their officials, and the different missionaries that operated schools on the Blood Reserve. But most importantly, I had an opportunity to work alongside a group of elders from my reserve who are survivors of the residential school system. And so we've been able to review some of these documents, photographs that I've collected, and to be able to take a look at the educational policies at that time, and to be able to share a Blackfoot perspective of these events and different school models that the Canadian government created. And so in school, if it is mentioned or talked about, colonization or even residential schools is really taught in a Eurocentric, whitewashed perspective. And so it was really important to me that I wanted to be able to learn this history from our perspective as Blackfoot people, to learn, what our stories and knowledge and memories are of this period of time in our lives. And so I've been able to work with a group of elders on a video series where we've come together and we've created 4 videos, each focused on a distinct time period. It begins in the 1870s and concludes in the 1980s when the last residential school closed on the Blood Reserve. And so we go through all of the school models, the corresponding educational policies that accompany each of the school model, and we take a look at some of the photographs, and they share stories that have been handed down to them from their family members about the different school models, as well as their own experiences attending some of these school models as well. And so we've just finished reviewing the videos that we've made, and I'm looking forward to being able to publish that and make it public, so that we have it as Blackfoot people, but something that we can also share with the rest of Canada. And these elders that I worked with on the project had encouraged me to write a book about the research that I've been conducting. And so, with, again, permission from my chief and council, I've been working on a manuscript that I'm hoping to be able to get out in the next couple of years that will go through this specific history of the colonial school system on the Blood Reserve. and I had an opportunity to create a traveling museum exhibit that was based on the research that I've conducted, that I've been on your podcast before to talk about. It's called Stolen Kainai Children: Stories of Survival. And so the Galt Museum and Archives in Lethbridge has taken it on as a traveling exhibit. So it can be booked through their website. And I go through each of the different school models. I share what the educational policies are for each of the school models. There's photographs and survivor stories that accompany each of the school models as well. And so I feel very privileged to be able to work in this space, and I'm profoundly grateful for the elders that have gifted me with their time and entrusted me with their stories. Their experiences are, absolutely vital to understanding what has happened to us as Blackfoot people, and it offers one way that we're able to confront the legacy of colonization that's been imposed through the educational system. And so it has been challenging to work, in this space. It definitely does take a toll on my mental health and wellness, especially going into the archives and reading what the Canadian government, their officials, and the religions truly thought about us. And it's very clear when you go in and you take a look at their writing that they never thought that Indigenous peoples would exist today. They were so sure that their assimilative agenda, that they could make Indigenous people disappear by becoming Euro Canadians within a few generations. And so, just the way that they talk about us in those documents, it's like we're not even human. And so it's been really quite a challenge to read those documents. But I do think that it's very necessary to do this work, to work with my elders, because it's something that we need, I think, as part of our healing journey, that we need to be able to understand what's happened in our past and how it relates to our present circumstances, so that we have a better idea about how we can move forward in our healing journey and being able to walk the path of reconciliation with the rest of Canada.
What role do language, culture, and land based education play in the healing process for day school survivors and their families?
I think language, culture, and land-based education is a very important step that can be taken in the healing process of not just day school survivors, but residential school survivors as well. Um, Language, culture, and land-based education, would have been something that they normally would have received had they been able to be educated within their own people's traditional knowledge systems, their traditional education systems as well. And so being forced to attend day school, residential school, really really robbed from them the opportunity to be able to learn this from their own family members, from their own tribal members as well. And so being able to offer experiences where they get to be able to reconnect with their language, as well as their culture and land-based education, that was, very deliberately targeted to the colonial education system to not allow them to receive those kinds of teachings. um, I think is one way that uh, Indigenous peoples can be able to help reconnect with these teachings that they again would have received if they didn't attend these institutions. And it's so important as well that they are able to receive these teachings so that they can continue to pass these teachings down to their children, and it gets passed down from generation to generation. Um, and so it's something that we should be working towards, being able to have those experiences.
What are your thoughts on reconciliation in Canada?
So we know it's been 10 years since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has come out with its 94 calls to action, and there have been several organizations, such as the Yellowhead Institute, that have been tracking their progress of how many calls to action have been completed. And unfortunately, in 2023, the Yellowhead Institute announced that it was no longer going to produce an annual accountability report because of the lack of significant progress that was being made. And in the very last report that they did publish, they said, open quote, in total, 13 of the 94 calls to action have been completed since 2015. That is a completion rate of 1.625 calls to action per year. If Canada continues at this pace, it will take another 58 years until the calls to action are completed, meaning that Indigenous peoples will have to wait until 2081 for reconciliation, close quote. And so that came out a few years ago. And according to Indigenous Watchdog, which is another organization that's been tracking the calls to action and its completion, and it says as of today that there's only been 15% of the calls to action completed. So that means there's still 85% that remains incomplete, particularly those that are related to child welfare, education, health, and justice. And so too often, reconciliation has been treated as a performative exercise rather than a structural, systemic commitment to justice and relationship repair. And we need meaningful action to take place and not just symbolic actions. And I think Canadian society has a tendency to think about reconciliation in the same way that they think about colonization. And so colonization is not an event that happened at one point in time. It's not something that ended a long time ago. It's something that continues every day, and the structures, systems, and inequities built into Canadian society. Colonization created a system of oppression designed to control, assimilate, and marginalize Indigenous peoples. And it's a system that benefits settlers while restricting and harming Indigenous communities through the laws, policies, and institutions that still continue to shape our daily lives. And so reconciliation must be approached with the same understanding. It's not a symbolic gesture. It's not a one-time event or a destination we can collectively arrive at and declare that it's complete now. True reconciliation is an ongoing, difficult, and necessary process grounded in truth-telling, accountability, and the dismantling of colonial systems that continue to produce inequity and harm. So it requires, meaningful transfer of power, authority, and resource to Indigenous communities, and to, move beyond passive acknowledgement towards active structural work to decolonize and to be able to offer justice. And so while we do have some steps that were taken at the community, educational, and policy levels, we still have a long road ahead. Reconciliation cannot be achieved without having the full participation in Canada. So having participation from our Indigenous leaders, the willingness of governments, federal, provincial, local institutions, and the public to be able to engage in these uncomfortable truths, to be able to have sustained action and a long-term relationship that's built in respect, restitution, and shared responsibility. So I know a lot of the calls to action haven't been completed, but I still have hope that we can still do much good and to be able to continue moving forward, working on the calls to action.
Is there anything you'd like to say directly to educators, students, or policymakers listening to this episode?
So far more has happened in Canada than just residential schools and day schools. And I think it's really important for the public to understand the full scope of the colonial violence that has been inflicted upon Indigenous peoples. The Canadian government and the different religions who operated these schools, went to extraordinary, very calculated lengths to try and erase Indigenous peoples, not just by targeting children through these institutions, but by deploying a series of assimilationist policies and school models for over a century and a half. And so to truly grasp the depth of this legacy, I think it's important that all Canadians understand this history, what all the school models are that have been used to try and assimilate Indigenous children. We need collective compassion, honesty, and empathy for what has been done to Indigenous peoples, and for how those deliberate actions have shaped the difficult realities that many Indigenous peoples endure today. Too often, Indigenous peoples are blamed and shamed for the present circumstances that we find ourselves in. It's as though we willingly authored the policies that dismantled our families, that criminalized our languages and ceremonies, and forced our children into these abusive institutions. We didn't create the Indian Act. We didn't outlaw our own cultures. These were imposed upon us, and we've carried the weight of these injustices for generations. And we've been confined in a place of survival rather than belonging to a nation where we can thrive in dignity and joy. And this must change, and we can't do it alone. We need allies. We need people to care not just about the injustices of the past, but about the futures that we deserve. We need Canadians to want to see Indigenous peoples living fully, freely, in happiness. It's a matter of justice and humanity. And it's important to remember that within our own Indigenous communities, that we're still navigating the truth of what has happened to us, the trauma inflicted through colonial schooling systems and oppressive policies that have fractured families and communities in ways that we're still coming to terms with. And we need grace, patience, and space as we undertake the difficult work of healing and rebuilding what was stolen from us. As Senator Murray Sinclair so wisely said, open quote, "This important work of reconciliation is not a one-day affair. It will take us several generations, as it took several generations to create the situation we now face," close quote. There are no quick fixes. This is generational work, hard, uncomfortable, but necessary work. And while we may not see the full fruits of these efforts in our lifetime, I think the struggle is worth it. I hope Canadians can see Indigenous peoples for our humanity and acknowledge how the colonial systems sought to strip it from us, to stand with us as we reclaim our dignity, languages, ceremonies, and futures that colonization has tried to take from us. I hope that Canadians won't turn away from the truth because it's difficult. It's something that must be confronted, and most importantly, to be able to walk the path of reconciliation with us is something that we want to be able to see in Canada.
Well said. Yes, I like that. Is your day school, are any of the schools still standing in on your reserve?
They have actually been rebuilt, and so what we have still standing on the Blood Reserve is we still have one of the residential schools. So we had two. We do have one that has been slated to be demolished, but the other day schools, they have been rebuilt, and so we still do have them in those communities, but they have been rebuilt.
Yeah. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if there's nothing else, I want to thank you for your time, for participating in the Legacy of Hope Foundation's Roots and Hoots Day School Series podcast. So thank you for your knowledge and things. I mean, some stuff that I didn't even know about. Anyways, thank you very much, Dr. Prete, and nice having you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for allowing me to be a part of your project, and I'm excited to be able to share it once it comes out.
You guys, awesome. Thank you very much, Dr. Prete.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning into this special podcast series on the Federal Indian Day School System, produced by the Legacy of Hope Foundation and made possible by the generous support from the Indigenous Screen Office. This series deals with difficult subject matter. The Hope for Wellness helpline is available 24/7 to Indigenous peoples across Canada and can be reached at 1-855-242-3310 or available through chat at hopeforwellness.ca. Counseling is available in English, French, Cree, Ojibwe, and Inuktitut on request. For more information about the Indigenous Screen Office, visit iso-bea.ca.